Introduction. The first light of dawn bathed the city of Rome in a golden hue, casting long shadows across the ancient streets that had seen centuries of triumph and tragedy. The Tiber River glistened as it wound its way through the heart of the empire, its waters whispering secrets of distant lands and forgotten battles. From his marble balcony, high above the bustling city, Emperor Marcus Aurelius stood alone, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was just beginning to rise. To the people of Rome, Marcus was more than a ruler. He was a living embodiment of wisdom and strength, a philosopher-king whose calm demeanor and steady hand had guided the empire through storm after storm. Yet as the emperor watched the dawn break, he felt a chill that no sunlight could dispel. It wasn't the cool morning air that troubled him, but the shadows that lingered in the corners of his mind, shadows born from the darkest recesses of his subconscious. For nights now, the emperor had been haunted by dreams so vivid, so terrifying, that they felt more real than the waking world. In these visions, he saw Rome in flames, its mighty walls crumbling, its people fleeing in despair. He heard the cries of the dying, saw the proud eagle of Rome brought low, and felt the crushing weight of failure upon his shoulders. Each time he awoke drenched in sweat, the echoes of his own screams fading into the night. These dreams were unlike any he had experienced before, more than mere nightmares. They carried with them a sense of foreboding, as if the gods themselves were sending him a warning, a glimpse into a future he could not control. But Marcus Aurelius was no stranger to fear. He had faced death on the battlefield, confronted treachery in the Senate, and weathered the storms of leadership for decades. Yet these dreams, these twisted reflections of his deepest anxieties, were something different. They gnawed at the edges of his stoic resolve, threatening to unravel the very fabric of his mind. As he stood on the balcony, the first rays of the sun warming his face, Marcus knew that he could not afford to ignore these visions any longer. The empire was on the brink of war, with barbarian tribes massing on the northern borders, hungry for the riches of Rome. His legions were strong, his generals loyal. But Marcus understood that the greatest battle he would face was not on the battlefield, but within the confines of his own mind. He turned away from the rising sun and walked back into the cool shadows of his chamber, his mind already set on what he must do. He would seek the counsel of Rusticus, his trusted mentor and friend, a man who had taught him the ways of Stoicism, the art of mastering the self. If anyone could help him understand the nature of these dreams and the power they held over him, it was Rusticus. But deep down, Marcus knew that this journey would be one he would have to undertake alone. The true enemy was not the barbarians at the gates, nor the traitors in the Senate. It was the fear that lurked in the darkest corners of his mind, the fear that, if left unchecked, could bring down not just an emperor, but an entire empire. As the city below began to stir with the sounds of another day, Marcus Aurelius steeled himself for the battle ahead. It would be a battle fought not with swords and shields, but with the power of the mind, a battle to reclaim his inner fortress from the shadows that threatened to consume it. And in that moment, as he prepared to confront his deepest fears, Marcus knew that the fate of Rome would be decided not by the strength of his legions, but by the strength of his soul. Chapter 1: Shadows of the Mind. The Senate Hall, an architectural marvel of towering columns and gleaming marble floors, echoed with the voices of Rome's most powerful men. Senators draped in their pristine togas debated fiercely, their words filled with both conviction and cunning. At the center of it all, seated on a grand dais beneath the proud Roman eagle, was Marcus Aurelius, his expression serene but his mind far from the proceedings. The emperor's thoughts drifted like clouds over a distant battlefield. Though his eyes remained fixed on the orator before him, his mind replayed the images from his recent dreams, visions of Rome engulfed in flames, its citizens in despair. The scenes were as vivid in his waking hours as they were in sleep, gnawing at his thoughts, even as he fulfilled his duties as ruler. And so, it is imperative that we increase the grain supply from Egypt, lest we face shortages in the coming winter, a senator concluded, his voice sharp with urgency. Marcus nodded absently, signaling his approval, but the words barely registered. The Senate could debate the empire's needs, but it was the need within his own soul that demanded his attention now. He could not shake the feeling that something far more dangerous than a grain shortage threatened Rome, a threat that resided deep within his own mind. As the meeting adjourned, the senators rose, bowing respectfully to their emperor, before filing out of the hall. Marcus remained seated, his hands resting on the arms of his chair, his eyes fixed on the empty space, where moments ago the Senate had been in full debate. He had ruled long enough to know that Rome's true strength lay not in its military might or its wealth, but in the clarity and resolve of its leaders. And now, as the weight of his visions pressed upon him, Marcus feared that his own clarity was slipping away. "Majesty," came a voice from behind, pulling him from his thoughts. It was his steward, Cassius, a man who had served him faithfully for years. "The Senate's proposals are ready for your review. Shall I bring them to your study?" Marcus looked up, his gaze steadying as he focused on the present. "Yes, Cassius. Later." He paused, then added, "And have Rusticus summoned to my quarters." Cassius bowed and withdrew, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts once more. The emperor rose slowly, the burden of the empire heavy on his shoulders. As he walked through the vast halls of the palace, he couldn't help but notice how the grandeur of Rome felt almost oppressive, a reflection of the weight that now seemed to press upon his very soul. In his private quarters, the light of the midday sun filtered through tall, narrow windows, casting long beams across the mosaic floor. Marcus stood by the window, staring out at the city that stretched beneath him, its busy streets, its bustling markets, its people unaware of the turmoil within their ruler. He had always found solace in the view from this height, where he could see the vastness of the empire he had sworn to protect. But today, even this familiar scene offered no comfort. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Rusticus. The old philosopher entered, his gait slow but sure, his presence as calming as a still pond. Rusticus had been Marcus's mentor since his youth, guiding him through the labyrinth of Stoic philosophy, teaching him to master his emotions, to find strength in reason, and to cultivate the inner citadel, the fortress of the mind that could withstand any storm. "Rusticus," Marcus greeted him, his voice betraying the weariness he felt. "Thank you for coming." "Always, my lord," Rusticus replied, his eyes sharp and discerning. He could see the strain in Marcus's posture, the tension in his brow. "You are troubled." Marcus sighed, nodding as he gestured for Rusticus to sit. "I have been having visions, dreams that plague my nights and disturb my days. They are not like any dreams I have had before. They feel real, Rusticus, as if they are not merely dreams, but glimpses of a possible future, one where Rome falls." Rusticus listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "The mind can be a treacherous place, Majesty, especially for those who bear the weight of the world upon their shoulders. What do these dreams show you?" "Destruction," Marcus replied, his voice low. "Fire, death. The eagle of Rome brought low. It is as if the gods themselves are warning me of something, but I cannot discern what. And even if these are not messages from the divine, I fear what they might mean about my own state of mind." Rusticus nodded slowly, absorbing the emperor's words. "Dreams are the echoes of the mind, reflections of our deepest fears and desires. They can guide us, but they can also deceive us. Tell me, what have you been feeling deep within that could give rise to such visions?" Marcus fell silent, turning inward as he searched for an answer. He had always prided himself on his stoic composure, his ability to maintain control over his thoughts and emotions, but these dreams had shaken him in ways he had not expected. "I fear failure, Rusticus," he admitted finally. "I fear that I will not be able to protect Rome, that all I have built will come to ruin." Rusticus leaned forward, his gaze piercing yet gentle. "The fear of failure is a heavy burden, but it is one that must be confronted, not avoided. The Stoic teachings remind us that we cannot control external events, only our responses to them. Your dreams are not a prophecy, Marcus, but a mirror reflecting your own doubts. The key is not to banish them, but to understand them, to integrate them into your conscious mind, where they can no longer hold power over you." Marcus listened carefully, absorbing the wisdom of his mentor. He knew that Rusticus was right, that the battle he faced was not against the external threats to Rome, but against the shadows within his own mind. And yet, knowing this did not make the task any easier. "How do I do this, Rusticus?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with both determination and uncertainty. "How do I confront these fears and ensure that they do not cloud my judgment or weaken my resolve?" Rusticus smiled faintly, a gesture of reassurance. "You must journey within, my lord. Through meditation and reflection, you will face these fears directly. You will find the source of your visions and understand what they truly represent. Only then will you be able to reclaim your inner fortress and stand unshaken in the face of any storm." The words resonated deeply with Marcus, offering a glimmer of hope in the midst of his turmoil. He knew the path would not be easy, but he also knew that it was the only way forward. He would delve into the depths of his mind, confront the fears that lurked there, and emerge stronger for it. For the sake of Rome, and for the sake of his own soul, Marcus Aurelius would face the shadows and fortify his inner citadel. As Rusticus rose to leave, Marcus clasped his mentor's hand in a gesture of gratitude. "Thank you, old friend. Your wisdom is, as always, a light in the darkness." Rusticus nodded, his eyes filled with quiet pride. "Remember, Majesty, that the mind is both a weapon and a shield. Wield it wisely, and no enemy, whether within or without, can defeat you." With those words, Rusticus departed, leaving Marcus alone once more. But this time, the emperor felt a newfound resolve. He turned back to the window, gazing out at the sprawling city below. The shadows of his mind still lingered, but now, with the guidance of his mentor, he was ready to confront them. The first steps of his journey had begun. The battle for his inner fortress was underway, and Marcus Aurelius, philosopher-king of Rome, would not rest until his mind was as unyielding as the empire he ruled. Chapter 2. The Seeds of Doubt. The streets of Rome buzzed with life as Marcus Aurelius made his way through the heart of the city, accompanied by a small retinue of guards. The people, upon recognizing their emperor, bowed deeply, their faces reflecting admiration and respect. Marcus nodded in return, but his thoughts remained distant, locked within the confines of his mind. The journey to visit his daughter, Lucilla, was meant to be a brief respite from the demands of his rule, yet the weight of his recent visions still clung to him like a shadow. Lucilla lived in a villa on the outskirts of Rome, a peaceful retreat surrounded by lush gardens and ancient olive trees. It was a place of tranquility, far removed from the political machinations and military concerns that dominated Marcus's life. As his carriage approached the villa, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of anticipation. Lucilla had always been a source of comfort and joy for him, a reminder of the simpler, purer aspects of life. The gates of the villa opened, and Marcus was greeted by the familiar sight of his daughter standing with a serene smile. Lucilla, a woman of grace and intelligence, bore a striking resemblance to her late mother, Faustina. Her presence alone seemed to lift some of the burden from Marcus's heart. "Father," Lucilla greeted him warmly, embracing him as he stepped out of the carriage. "It is good to see you." "And you, my dear," Marcus replied, returning the embrace. "It has been too long." As they walked through the gardens, Lucilla could sense the tension in her father's demeanor. Though Marcus had always been a master of hiding his emotions, Lucilla had inherited her mother's keen intuition. She knew when something troubled him. "Father, you seem unsettled," she remarked gently as they paused by a small fountain, its waters trickling softly in the background. "Is something amiss?" Marcus hesitated, contemplating whether to burden his daughter with the weight of his fears. But Lucilla had always been more than just a daughter. She was a confidant, wise beyond her years. "I have been having dreams, Lucilla," Marcus began, choosing his words carefully. "Disturbing visions of Rome's downfall. They have been persistent, vivid, and I cannot seem to escape them, even in my waking hours." Lucilla listened intently, her expression one of concern and understanding. "Dreams can be powerful, Father, but they are not always what they seem. What do you think they mean?" Marcus sighed, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I do not know. Rusticus believes they are manifestations of my own fears, fears that I have not fully confronted. He is guiding me to explore these fears, to understand them so that they do not cloud my judgment." "And do you believe him?" Lucilla asked softly, her voice gentle but probing. "I do," Marcus admitted, turning to face her, "but knowing that does not make the process any easier. I fear that if I do not resolve this within myself, it could affect not only me, but the entire empire. Rome needs a strong leader, one who is not distracted by the shadows of his own mind." Lucilla placed a hand on her father's arm, offering a comforting presence. "You are the strongest man I know, Father, not because you are without fear, but because you face it with wisdom and courage. If anyone can overcome these shadows, it is you." Her words, though simple, struck a chord within Marcus. He realized that the love and support of his family were also part of the strength he needed to draw upon. The shadows in his mind, though daunting, were not insurmountable. He'd faced countless challenges before, both as a ruler and as a man. This, too, was a challenge he could overcome, if he approached it with the same determination and clarity he had brought to every other aspect of his life. "Thank you, Lucilla," Marcus said, his voice steadying. "Your words mean more to me than you know." Lucilla smiled, a warmth in her eyes that reminded Marcus of her mother. "You have always taught me that the mind is our greatest ally, Father. Now it is time for you to remember that lesson as well." They continued their walk through the gardens, the conversation shifting to lighter topics: Lucilla's children, the latest news from the provinces, the simple joys of life that Marcus rarely had time to appreciate. Yet, even as they spoke, the emperor could feel the seeds of doubt within him beginning to wither, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. But as night fell and Marcus prepared to leave the villa, a new realization dawned on him. While his fears might be reflections of his subconscious, they were also deeply tied to the realities of the world around him. Rome was indeed facing dangers, both from within and without, and the more he thought about it, the more he understood that his dreams might be urging him to address these threats more directly. As his carriage rolled away from Lucilla's villa, Marcus looked back at the peaceful retreat, a sanctuary in the midst of the storm. He knew he could not afford to stay here, away from the responsibilities that awaited him in Rome. The battle he faced was twofold, one within the fortress of his mind and one against the very real forces that sought to challenge the empire. He would need to draw upon all his strength, wisdom, and the Stoic principles he had lived by to face both. And as the city of Rome loomed in the distance, Marcus Aurelius steeled himself for the battles ahead, resolved to fortify not just his mind, but the empire he had sworn to protect. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. The skies over Rome had darkened, clouds heavy with the promise of rain looming ominously above the city. Marcus Aurelius stood in the war room of his palace, surrounded by maps and scrolls detailing the latest intelligence from the empire's borders. The room was filled with the low murmur of voices, generals, strategists, and advisors all discussing the growing threat from the northern barbarian tribes. Yet, as Marcus listened, his thoughts were once again pulled inward, back to the visions that haunted him. The northern tribes had grown bolder, their raids on Roman outposts increasing in both frequency and ferocity. Reports from the front lines spoke of entire legions struggling to hold their ground, of supply lines being cut, and of the enemy gathering in unprecedented numbers. Marcus knew that a confrontation was inevitable, but it was not the threat of battle that weighed most heavily on his mind. It was the unsettling feeling that his visions were connected to the events unfolding before him. "Majesty," General Pertinac's voice broke through Marcus's reverie. The general, a seasoned warrior with years of experience on the frontier, stepped forward to address the emperor directly. "The reports from our scouts confirm that the barbarian tribes are uniting under a single leader, a chieftain named Alaric. He's managed to forge alliances where others have failed, and his forces are unlike anything we've faced before." Marcus nodded, absorbing the information. "What do we know of this Alaric?" Pertinax frowned. "Not much, my lord. He's a shadowy figure, but the tribes speak of him as a man of great charisma and ruthless ambition. He's promised them the riches of Rome, and it seems they believe he can deliver." A silence fell over the room as the weight of the situation settled upon the gathered leaders. Rome had faced many threats in its long history, but the unity of the northern tribes under a single leader was unprecedented and deeply concerning. "We must prepare for the worst," Marcus finally said, his voice calm but resolute. "If Alaric seeks to challenge Rome, we will meet him with the full strength of the empire, but we must also be wise. This is not a battle we can win with brute force alone." The generals murmured their agreement, and the discussions resumed with renewed urgency. But Marcus's mind was only half on the military strategies being proposed. The rest of his thoughts were consumed by a growing sense of unease, a feeling that there was something more at play, something that transcended the physical world of battles and borders. As the meeting drew to a close, Marcus dismissed his advisors and generals, instructing them to prepare the legions for the campaign ahead. He remained behind in the war room, the maps and charts spread out before him, but his gaze was distant, lost in thought. It was then that Cassius, his steward, quietly entered the room. "Majesty, you asked to be informed if any news arrived from the Senate. A letter has just been delivered." Marcus took the scroll from Cassius, breaking the seal with a practiced motion. As he unrolled the parchment and began to read, his expression hardened. The letter was from Senator Lucius, one of the more ambitious and influential members of the Senate. It spoke of growing unrest within the political ranks, of senators questioning the emperor's focus on the northern campaign, while other parts of the empire faced neglect. Marcus read the words carefully, recognizing the thinly veiled threats and power plays that were typical of Lucius. The senator was a shrewd politician, always maneuvering to increase his influence. In this letter, he hinted at the possibility of the Senate withdrawing its support for the war effort if Marcus did not address the concerns of the Roman elite. Politics, Marcus muttered to himself, feeling the familiar frustration rise within him. While Rome faced a real and imminent threat on its borders, the Senate continued to play its games, concerned more with their personal power than the welfare of the empire. It was a reminder that the battles Marcus faced were not just on the fields of war, but within the very heart of Rome itself. "Cassius," Marcus called, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Summon Rusticus. I will need his counsel." The steward bowed and swiftly left the room. Marcus set the letter aside, his thoughts once again drifting back to his visions. He could not shake the feeling that his dreams and the events unfolding around him were connected in ways he did not fully understand. The fear of Rome's collapse, the gathering storm in the north, and the brewing unrest in the Senate all seemed intertwined, like strands of a web that threatened to ensnare him. As he waited for Rusticus, Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The Stoic teachings had always guided him, offering a path of reason and virtue amidst the chaos of the world. But now, as the shadows in his mind grew darker and the challenges before him more complex, he wondered if even the wisdom of Stoicism could provide the answers he sought. Rusticus arrived shortly, his presence as grounding as ever. The old philosopher approached Marcus with the same calm demeanor that had always provided the emperor with comfort in times of distress. "Majesty," Rusticus greeted him with a respectful nod. "I am at your service." Marcus did not hesitate. "Rusticus, I am troubled. The visions I spoke of earlier, they grow more frequent, more vivid. And now, as the barbarian threat looms and the Senate stirs with unrest, I fear that my mind is trying to tell me something that I cannot yet grasp." Rusticus listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. "The mind is a complex thing, Majesty. It can see connections that the conscious self might miss, can perceive threats that are not yet fully realized. But it can also deceive, projecting fears into places where they do not belong." Marcus nodded, absorbing his mentor's words. "I feel as if I am caught between two battles, one against the external threats to Rome, and one within myself. How do I navigate this? How do I know what is real and what is merely the product of my own doubts and fears?" Rusticus stepped closer, his voice low and measured. "The key, my lord, lies in understanding that the mind is both a mirror and a compass. It reflects what we fear, what we hope, what we know deep down to be true. But it also guides us, if we allow it to. Your visions may be a warning, or they may be a challenge, an opportunity to confront the things that you fear most and emerge stronger for it." Marcus met Rusticus's gaze, feeling the steady strength in the old man's words. "Then I must face these visions head-on. I must delve deeper into my mind, confront whatever it is that lies there, and find the clarity I need to lead Rome through these dark times." Rusticus nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "That is the path of the Stoic, Majesty. To confront fear with reason, to face uncertainty with courage. You are not alone in this journey, and you have the wisdom within you to find the answers you seek." The words brought a measure of peace to Marcus's troubled mind. He knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that he was not without guidance. The battle within his mind, like the battles he had fought on the fields of war, required strategy, patience, and resilience. As the storm clouds gathered over Rome, Marcus Aurelius made a silent vow to himself. He would face the shadows within, confront the fears that threatened to undermine his strength, and emerge victorious. For the sake of Rome, and for the sake of his own soul, he would reclaim the inner fortress that had always been his greatest weapon. Chapter 4. The Labyrinth of the Mind. The torches flickered softly in the dimly lit chamber as Marcus Aurelius sat cross-legged on the floor, the cool marble beneath him grounding his thoughts. The room was sparsely decorated, designed for solitude and reflection rather than luxury. A small altar stood at one end, bearing a simple bronze statue of Athena, goddess of wisdom, a figure to whom Marcus often turned in his moments of deepest contemplation. Tonight, the emperor was alone, the sounds of the bustling palace distant and muted. It was in this quiet, sacred space that Marcus had chosen to confront the visions that haunted him, to delve into the labyrinth of his own mind and seek the answers that eluded him. The meditative practices taught by Rusticus had become his anchor, a way to explore the vast, uncharted territories of his subconscious. As Marcus closed his eyes, the world around him faded into darkness, leaving only the steady rhythm of his breath. He began the process of calming his thoughts, allowing each exhalation to carry away the burdens of the day. The unrest in the Senate, the looming threat of Alaric's forces, the doubts that had taken root in his heart. He focused instead on the stillness within, the quiet place where wisdom could be found if one was patient enough to listen. Slowly, the darkness in his mind began to take shape, forming a familiar yet unsettling landscape, the same one that had appeared in his dreams so many times before. He found himself standing at the edge of a desolate battlefield, the sky above him blood-red, the earth scorched and barren. In the distance, he could see the smouldering ruins of Rome, the once proud city reduced to ash and rubble. The cries of the dying echoed in the air, a haunting reminder of the destruction he feared. But this time, Marcus was not merely an observer of his own vision. He was a participant, fully conscious and aware, capable of exploring this mental landscape with a clarity that had previously eluded him. He knew that this was no ordinary dream. It was a journey into the depths of his own psyche, a chance to confront the fears and doubts that had been plaguing him. As he walked through the ruins, Marcus felt a cold wind brush against his skin, carrying with it the scent of smoke and decay. The air was thick with despair, the remnants of a world that had been utterly destroyed. Yet beneath the surface, he sensed something else, an undercurrent of power, a force that had shaped this vision and given it life. It was his own mind, both the architect and the destroyer, reflecting his deepest fears in a form he could no longer ignore. Marcus continued his journey through the twisted landscape, his eyes scanning the ruins for any sign of life, any clue that might reveal the meaning behind this vision. As he passed by the crumbling walls of what had once been the Senate, he saw a figure standing in the shadows, barely visible through the smoke and darkness. Cautiously Marcus approached, his steps measured and deliberate. The figure became clearer as he drew near. A man, dressed in the armor of a Roman soldier, his back turned to Marcus. There was something familiar about him, something that made Marcus' heart quicken with a mixture of recognition and dread. "Who are you?" Marcus called out, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of tension. The figure slowly turned to face him, and Marcus felt a jolt of shock as he looked into the man's eyes. They were his own eyes, reflected back at him from a face that was eerily similar to his own. The man before him wasn't merely a soldier. He was Marcus Aurelius, or rather, a shadow of himself, an embodiment of his deepest fears and insecurities. "You know who I am," the figure replied, his voice a mirror of Marcus's own, but colder, more distant. "I am the part of you that you have tried to ignore. The part that fears failure, that doubts your own strength, the part that believes Rome is doomed." Marcus stared at the figure, understanding now that this was the manifestation of the very fears he had come here to confront. "I have faced these fears before," he said, his voice firm, "but I will not allow them to control me." The shadowy figure smiled, a faint, knowing smile that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "You may believe that, but these fears are not so easily dismissed. They have taken root within you, and they grow stronger with every doubt, every hesitation. You fear not only for Rome, but for yourself, for the legacy you will leave behind." Marcus felt a pang of truth in the figure's words, but he refused to be swayed. "Legacy is not what drives me," he replied, his voice growing stronger. "What matters is that I fulfill my duty to Rome, that I lead with wisdom and courage. The future is beyond my control, but my actions in the present are what define me." The shadowy figure tilted his head slightly, as if considering Marcus's words. "Perhaps, but can you truly say that you are free from fear? Can you claim that you do not wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, wondering if all that you have built will crumble to dust?" Marcus remained silent for a moment, reflecting on the truth of those questions. He had indeed felt those fears, had indeed wondered if his efforts would be enough to preserve the empire he had dedicated his life to. But he also knew that fear was a natural part of the human experience, something that could be acknowledged, but not allowed to dictate one's actions. "I do feel fear," Marcus admitted finally, "but I will not allow it to control me. I have learned that fear is like a shadow. It only has power if you turn your back to the light. I choose to face the light, to confront my fears with reason and virtue." The shadowy figure regarded him with a mixture of respect and challenge. "Then prove it. Confront me here and now. Show me that you can master the darkness within you, that you can stand firm, even when the world around you is falling apart." Marcus squared his shoulders, feeling a surge of resolve. This was the test he had known would come, the moment where he would confront the deepest parts of himself and prove that he could emerge victorious. He took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the shadowy figure, and looked directly into his own eyes. "I will not be swayed by doubt," Marcus declared, his voice strong and clear. "I am the master of my mind, the guardian of my inner citadel. You are but a reflection, a manifestation of my fears, and I will not allow you to dictate my fate." The figure's smile faded, replaced by an expression of solemn acknowledgement. "Then show me your strength," he said, his voice now softer, almost pleading. "Show me that you can rise above the darkness, that you can lead Rome with the clarity and wisdom that only a true Stoic can possess." With that, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the smoke and shadows that surrounded them. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He stood alone in the desolate landscape, the ruins of Rome still visible around him, but the fear that had once gripped him was now replaced by a deep, unshakable resolve. He understood now that the visions were not prophecies of doom, but challenges, opportunities for him to confront the fears that had been festering within him and to reaffirm his commitment to the Stoic principles that had guided him throughout his life. The battle for his inner fortress was far from over, but Marcus knew that he had taken a crucial step forward. As the vision began to fade, Marcus allowed himself to return to the present, the cold marble of the meditation chamber grounding him once more. He opened his eyes, breathing deeply as he reacquainted himself with the physical world. The chamber was quiet, the torches still flickering softly, and outside, the storm had begun to break, the first drops of rain pattering against the stone walls. Marcus rose slowly, feeling a newfound strength within him. He knew that the challenges ahead would be great, both within his own mind and in the world beyond. But he also knew that he was prepared to face them. The labyrinth of his mind had revealed its darkest corners, but Marcus Aurelius had emerged stronger, more resolute, and more determined than ever to protect the empire he loved. He would not let fear dictate his actions. He would lead Rome with wisdom, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the principles that had guided him throughout his life. The storm was coming, but Marcus was ready. His inner fortress had been fortified, and he would stand unshaken in the face of whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 5. The Unseen Enemy. The first light of dawn broke through the rain-soaked clouds, casting a pale glow over the Roman countryside. Marcus Aurelius stood at the edge of the camp, the air crisp with the scent of wet earth and pine. The legions were stirring, soldiers emerging from their tents, armor clinking as they prepared for another day of marching. The road ahead would take them closer to the northern frontiers, where the barbarian forces gathered like a dark storm on the horizon. But Marcus's thoughts were not solely on the coming battle. The journey within his own mind had given him new clarity, but it had also revealed a deeper truth. His fears, though confronted, were still connected to the very real threats that loomed over Rome. The barbarian leader Alaric was not just a distant menace. He represented the embodiment of chaos and destruction that Marcus had seen in his visions. The emperor knew that the confrontation with Alaric would be more than a mere military campaign. It would be the ultimate test of his resolve and his leadership. As Marcus walked through the camp, his presence commanded the respect and attention of his soldiers. These men, hardened by years of service, looked to him not just as their emperor, but as a source of unwavering strength. They did not know of the battles he fought within his own mind, nor did they need to. What mattered to them was the man who stood before them, a leader who had guided them through countless victories and who would guide them through this challenge as well. General Pertinax approached, his expression as serious as ever. "Majesty, the scouts have returned with news. Alaric's forces are larger than we anticipated. They've been reinforced by additional tribes from beyond the Danube. We're facing a formidable enemy." Marcus nodded, absorbing the information with the calm demeanor that had become his hallmark. "What do we know of their movements?" "They're massing near the river Danuvius," Pertinax replied. "It seems Alaric intends to use the river as a natural barrier, drawing us into a trap. If we're not careful, we could find ourselves surrounded." Marcus considered the strategy, his mind working through the possibilities. Alaric was cunning, using both terrain and numbers to his advantage. But Marcus knew that battles were not won by force alone. They were won by outthinking the enemy, by anticipating their moves and turning their strengths into weaknesses. "We will not give him that opportunity," Marcus said, his voice firm. "We will meet him on our terms, not his. Have the engineers prepare for a bridge across the river, but we will not cross it until we are certain of our advantage. In the meantime, I want the legions ready for rapid deployment. We will strike when and where Alaric least expects it." Pertinax saluted, a glint of respect in his eyes. "Yes, Majesty, I will see to it at once." As the general departed, Marcus remained standing at the edge of the camp, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. He could feel the weight of the coming battle pressing down on him, the sense that this was more than just another campaign. It was a pivotal moment, one that would determine the future of Rome and test the very limits of his leadership. His thoughts drifted to the Senate, where Senator Lucius and his allies were undoubtedly watching and waiting, ready to seize upon any sign of weakness. The political machinations in Rome were a constant source of tension, a reminder that the enemies of the empire were not just those who wielded swords and spears, but also those who wielded words and influence. But Marcus had no time to dwell on the intrigues of the Senate. His focus needed to be on the task at hand, defeating Alaric and securing the northern borders. The visions that had plagued him were a warning, but they were also a challenge. He could not afford to be paralyzed by fear or doubt. Instead, he needed to use the clarity he had gained to guide his actions, to lead with both wisdom and strength. The day passed in a blur of preparations. The legions moved with practiced efficiency, setting up fortifications, organizing supply lines, and drilling for the battles to come. Marcus took time to walk among the soldiers, speaking with them, offering words of encouragement. He knew that their morale was as important as their swords. A confident soldier was a formidable one. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the camp settled into a tense quiet. The night was clear, the stars sharp against the dark sky, and the air held the promise of a coming storm. Marcus retired to his tent, but sleep eluded him. He found himself staring at the maps spread out before him, the lines and symbols representing the vast territories of the empire and the forces that sought to challenge them. It was in this quiet moment that Cassius, his faithful steward, entered the tent. Cassius was more than just a servant. He was a confidant, a man who had been by Marcus's side through many trials. "Majesty," Cassius began, his voice low, "there is something you should see. One of our scouts found it near the river." Marcus looked up, intrigued. Cassius handed him a small object wrapped in cloth. When Marcus unwrapped it, he found a medallion, intricately carved with the image of a wolf, a symbol often associated with the barbarian tribes. But there was something else about it, something that caught Marcus's attention. Inscribed on the back were the words in Latin, "Fortitudo in adversis," strength in adversity. It was left in plain sight as if meant to be found, Cassius explained. Marcus turned the medallion over in his hands, pondering its meaning. Was it a message from Alaric? A taunt, perhaps, or a challenge? The words resonated with him, echoing the very principles he had been reflecting on in his meditations. Alaric is not just a barbarian leader, Marcus mused aloud. He is a man of intellect, a strategist. He understands the power of symbols, of psychology. This is not merely a threat, it's an attempt to unnerve us, to make us question our own strength. Cassius nodded, sensing the gravity of the moment. "What will you do, Majesty?" Marcus closed his hand around the medallion, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic. "I will show him that Rome does not bow to fear. We will meet him on the battlefield, but we will do so on our own terms. Alaric may be a formidable enemy, but he underestimates the strength that lies in the resolve of the Roman people." With those words, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle ahead was not just one of swords and tactics, but of wills. Alaric sought to sow doubt, to weaken Rome from within, but Marcus would not allow that to happen. He would use every ounce of his wisdom, every lesson learned from his journey within, to lead his people through the storm. The night deepened, and Marcus finally allowed himself to rest. As he lay in the quiet of his tent, the medallion still clutched in his hand, he knew that the battle for Rome's future was about to begin. But more than that, he knew that the true battle, the one within his own mind, had already been won. With his inner fortress fortified, Marcus Aurelius was ready to face whatever the dawn would bring. Chapter 6. The Battle. The river Danuvius lay ahead, its waters dark and swift under the cloudy morning sky. The Roman legions, disciplined and resolute, lined the southern bank, their armor gleaming in the muted light. Across the river, Alaric's forces were visible, an imposing mass of warriors gathered under the banners of their united tribes. The tension in the air was palpable, a silence hanging over the battlefield like the calm before a storm. Marcus Aurelius sat astride his horse at the forefront of his army, his expression calm and unreadable. His mind was a fortress, fortified by the inner journey he had undertaken in the days leading up to this moment. The clarity he had found within himself now guided his every decision, every command. The strategy was simple in its brilliance. The Romans would feign an aggressive frontal assault, drawing Alaric's attention and luring him into committing his forces. Meanwhile, a smaller elite force, led by the trusted centurion Decimus, had crossed the river further downstream under the cover of night. Their mission was to flank the enemy from behind, cutting off their retreat and sowing chaos within their ranks. As the first rays of the sun broke through the clouds, Marcus raised his hand, signaling the beginning of the assault. The Roman infantry advanced in perfect formation, shields raised, spears at the ready. The ground trembled under the weight of their march, a disciplined and unstoppable force moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Alaric's forces responded as expected, surging forward to meet the Romans head-on. The two armies clashed with a thunderous roar, the sounds of battle filling the air, clashing steel, the cries of the wounded, the shouts of commanders rallying their men. From his vantage point, Marcus observed the battlefield with keen eyes. He could see Alaric at the center of his army, directing his warriors with brutal efficiency. The barbarian leader was no mere savage. He was a strategist, using the terrain and the superior numbers of his forces to his advantage. But Marcus had anticipated this. He knew that Alaric's strength lay in his ability to inspire fear and chaos, to turn the tide of battle through sheer force of will. The Roman legions held their ground, their discipline and training evident as they repelled wave after wave of barbarian attacks. But this was not the true battle. This was merely the opening act, a diversion. Marcus kept his gaze fixed on the far side of the battlefield, where Decimus and his elite force would soon emerge. The timing had to be perfect. If they struck too soon, they would be overwhelmed. Too late, and the opportunity would be lost. Minutes felt like hours as the battle raged on. The Roman lines held, but the pressure was immense. Then, just as it seemed the tide might turn against them, Marcus saw the signal he had been waiting for, a plume of smoke rising from behind the enemy lines, a sign that Decimus had reached his position. With a decisive motion, Marcus signaled the next phase of the plan. The Roman cavalry, held in reserve until now, charged forward, thundering across the battlefield toward the weakened flanks of Alaric's army. At the same moment, Decimus and his men launched their surprise attack from the rear, cutting through the barbarian ranks with ruthless efficiency. Chaos erupted within Alaric's forces. Caught between the advancing Roman cavalry and the flanking force, the barbarians found themselves surrounded, their retreat cut off. The discipline that had held them together began to fracture as fear took hold. Warriors who had once fought with ferocity now hesitated, their confidence shattered. Alaric himself was at the center of the maelstrom, desperately trying to rally his men. But the psychological blow was too great. The Romans had outmaneuvered him, turning his own strategy against him. The battle was no longer one of strength but of will, and the will of the Roman legions, bolstered by their emperor's leadership, was unbreakable. Marcus watched as the tide of battle turned decisively in Rome's favor. The enemy was in full retreat, fleeing toward the river only to find their path blocked by Decimus's men. What had begun as a carefully orchestrated assault had become a rout. With the battle nearing its end, Marcus led a final charge, his presence on the battlefield a symbol of Rome's enduring strength. He rode at the head of his cavalry, cutting through the remaining pockets of resistance with precision and control. His men followed with renewed vigor, inspired by the sight of their emperor leading them to victory. As the last of Alaric's forces were driven into the river or captured, the battlefield fell silent, save for the groans of the wounded and the cries of victory from the Roman soldiers. The battle was won, but Marcus knew that this victory was not just a military one. It was a victory of the mind, of strategy over brute force, of discipline over chaos. He dismounted from his horse, surveying the field of battle. The cost had been high. Many good men had fallen, but Rome had emerged victorious. The threat of Alaric and his united tribes had been crushed, the northern borders secured once more. Marcus took a moment to reflect, his thoughts turning inward even as his men celebrated around him. The battle had tested him in every way, physically, mentally, and emotionally. But it had also reaffirmed the lessons he had learned through his meditations and reflections. The greatest battles were not fought on the fields of war, but within the mind. By mastering himself, by confronting his fears and doubts, he had been able to lead his men to victory. As the sun set over the battlefield, casting a golden light over the fallen and the victorious alike, Marcus Aurelius knew that this was a moment that would define his reign. It was not just a victory for Rome, but a victory for the principles of Stoicism that had guided him throughout his life. He would return to Rome, not just as a conqueror, but as a leader who had proven that true strength lay not in the sword, but in the mind. The battle was over, but the lessons learned would endure, shaping the future of the empire and the legacy of its philosopher-king. Conclusion: the wisdom of the emperor. The gates of Rome swung open to the triumphant return of the legions. The people lined the streets, their cheers echoing off the ancient stone walls as Marcus Aurelius and his soldiers entered the city. Banners fluttered in the wind, and flowers were strewn in their path, a celebration of the victory that had secured the empire's northern borders and reaffirmed Rome's strength. Yet, amid the jubilation, Marcus remained composed, his thoughts reflecting the deeper meaning of the journey that had led him here. The victory over Alaric had not only been a military triumph but also a personal one. The battles Marcus had fought within himself had prepared him for the challenges on the battlefield, allowing him to lead with a clarity and resolve that had been tested and strengthened through adversity. As the emperor made his way through the throngs of people, his mind was focused on the lessons that had emerged from this crucible of war. In the days following the battle, Marcus convened with the Senate, addressing the concerns that had been brewing during his absence. His tone was measured, his words deliberate. He spoke not only of the military victory, but of the importance of unity and resolve in the face of external threats. The Senate, which had once wavered, now saw in their emperor a leader who had not only defended Rome, but had done so with wisdom that transcended the immediate crisis. Marcus's address to the Senate was a turning point. He reminded the senators that the strength of Rome lay not just in its legions, but in the collective resolve of its people and leaders. The threats from within, political intrigue, division, and complacency were as dangerous as any external foe. He called for renewed commitment to the principles that had made Rome great: justice, discipline, and the pursuit of the common good. In the quiet moments that followed his speech, Marcus retreated to his private quarters, the weight of leadership ever present, but now accompanied by a sense of fulfillment. The battle had revealed much to him, not only about the empire he ruled, but about himself, the fears that had once plagued him, the doubts that had surfaced in his darkest hours, had been confronted and understood. They had not disappeared, but they no longer held the power they once had. He reflected on the journey that had begun with those unsettling visions, the nightmares that had seemed to foretell doom. What he had come to realize was that those visions were not a curse, but a challenge, a call to delve deeper into his own mind and confront the fears that lurked there. By doing so, he had fortified his inner citadel, making him a stronger, wiser leader. As Marcus penned his thoughts into what would later be known as meditations, he wrote not only for himself, but for future generations. His reflections were a testament to the power of the mind, the importance of inner strength, and the enduring value of Stoic philosophy. He had learned that true leadership was not about the absence of fear, but about mastering it, using it as a tool to sharpen one's resolve and guide one's actions. The city of Rome settled into a calm, the immediate threats quelled, the empire once again secure. But Marcus knew that the peace was fragile, that challenges would continue to arise. Yet he was ready. The battle had been won, not just on the field, but within himself. His mind, once troubled by doubt, was now a fortress of clarity and purpose. The legacy of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-king, would endure not because of the battles he fought, but because of the wisdom he imparted. He had shown that the greatest victories are those won within, that the strength of an empire is mirrored in the strength of its leader's mind. As he looked out over the city from his palace, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he had fulfilled his duty to Rome and to himself. The journey had not ended, but a new chapter had begun, one where the lessons learned would guide him through whatever storms lay ahead. For Marcus Aurelius, the true battle was never with the enemies of Rome, but with the fears and doubts within. And in that battle he had emerged victorious, his inner fortress unshaken, his legacy secure. The sun set over Rome, casting the city in a golden light. Marcus Aurelius stood at the balcony of his palace, gazing out at the empire he had fought to protect. The echoes of the past weeks lingered in his mind, but they were now quiet, resolved, and integrated into the fabric of his being. He was ready for whatever the future would bring, for he had mastered the most important lesson of all, that true power comes not from the strength of one's armies, but from the strength of one's soul. And so, as the city below him settled into the quiet of evening, Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, philosopher and Stoic, turned from the view and walked back into the palace, a man at peace with himself and with the world.